Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. I hope you're having an amazing day. Throw a note in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from, any highlights from your day, and let us know if you can see and hear us okay. I'm here with the one and only Dedeker Winston. Super looking forward to this. I feel like you're like one of the OGs of Poly podcast. It was actually during the pandemic that I discovered polyamory, and that I have kind of been practicing solo poly for the past decade without really knowing it.
Nice. It's nice to discover a label that fits.
Oh, it was huge. It was like, oh, that's why I felt so different from everyone else for so long. It's because I've been I don't know, I identify with this thing that's not very like culturally accepted. It was funny. I was having a conversation on Sunday with a guy who's doing a big workshop with Jessica Fern and some other poly folks, and just trying to help mainly, I think, couples that are opening up, work through the stuff that comes up when you do open up. Mm-hmm. And I had actually reached out to him because he's had a couple like promotional webinars leading up to this weekend. And I feel like he's really addressing the triggers that can come up for one partner within a couple. Yeah. And a lot of the suggestions that they're offering is really about kind of like protecting the primary couple without much like care and consideration for other partners who are involved. Right. Yes. And so I shared, I'm like, listen, I'm loving your content. I really like Jessica Fern. I'm a huge attachment theory junkie and have been for a while now. But I'm really not feeling like the content is intended for me. Like it almost feels like it's intended to protect people against me. Yeah. The triggers that our connection can have. Yeah. Do you find that a lot of the content on polyamory is really meant for couples that maybe started out monogamous and opened up?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's changing. Like definitely what I saw around maybe let's say 2016, 2017 was when I started to see much more of an explosion of content creators from different perspectives and different relationship styles, where we suddenly got a lot more people talking about solo polyamory or relationship anarchy or non-hierarchical polyamory or things like that. Like that's when we started to see that really take off. However, we are still kind of saddled with, of course, our general umbrella of, mononormativity and assumptions that anything we're doing is going to be about the primary couple. And I don't think that like choosing to relate that way is necessarily toxic by default. Right. However, I can definitely relate to that there is a lot of content out there or workshops that I see where the branding is even very coupley. And I get why people might choose to do that is because, non-monogamy is really scary. And even if you and your partner have been talking about it for a while, it's still an unknown. It still can be a big change. And so I totally understand why people creating content or educating want to put forward this branding of like, look, it's going to help you grow closer. It's going to be safe. It's going to be okay. And it's like, those things are true. But yeah, I've definitely felt that same thing of feeling like this content isn't really for me necessarily. And I think, you hit the nail on the head of like, it feels like this is more about training people how to avoid me specifically.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in our conversation, one of the things that the host brought up, and I think he identifies as a little bit more hierarchical, especially now. I think he has awareness of his partner's anxious, preoccupied attachment style and realizes that he wasn't really attuned to that before or aware of it before. And I think now he's trying to kind of make up for that a little bit by like extra kind of protective of her nervous system and her feelings and experiences. And, he was talking about this idea of seatbelts and speed bumps. So anytime a new partner comes in, it's like this idea of allowing his partner based on her nervous system and her triggers to kind of set the pace in a way that she feels comfortable with. And I said, And he said, is that the type of thing that you would be open to? And I said, is there reciprocity in that if I experience a trigger, is she open to, responding to what I need? And there wasn't really a response. And I feel like that there tends to be from the primary couple, the sense of like, work with us here. Whereas there's not kind of that reciprocity back.
Right.
And I've experienced that, in my dating as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, couples privilege is, well documented, well experienced dynamic that a lot of people have come up against in unfortunately some really painful, really hurtful ways. I think that it's a balancing act because on the one hand, I think that it's really important for us to value not only our own autonomy, but also our partner's autonomy as well, and their autonomy to choose what they do or don't do with their own bodies. At the same time, it's also really important for us to have boundaries and stick up for ourselves, have an awareness of what we need, and to feel like we can be cared for by a partner. Of course, there's so many things. There's a shadow side to it that, like, the shadow side of extreme autonomy is I don't care how hard of a time you have, you need to deal with it. And that's also not healthy. So, it is this balancing act of being able to find what are the ways that we can care for each other and not feel like our partner's completely disregarding us and completely not taking us into consideration, while also being able to still support that autonomy. And it's definitely a balancing act for sure. And that balancing act is going to look slightly differently depending on the person, depending on what they need, depending on their trauma history and relationship history. It's going to be something that ideally with some good communication and good boundaries, we find ways to massage that out in our relationships.
Yeah. Someone just asked, isn't it true that the person who has the power to say no has the real power?
That's an interesting question. Because, I think that that's a question that begs asking about the context there. Because is it, I have the power to say no about what you do, about what your actions are, which is a little different from I have the power to say no about what I do, what I'm willing to do or not do, what I'm willing to accept done to me or not done to me, things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think the thing with the couples privilege, with hierarchical polyamory, where there is a very extreme power dynamic, I think that the important thing is that it's like, I don't want to actually tell anybody flat out, that's forbidden. You can't do that. Do everything in your power to avoid that. Because I do believe that, like, there can be hierarchical polyamory that's very non-controlling and very loving and very good for everyone involved. And there can be non-hierarchical polyamory that's very toxic and controlling and bad. So it's not necessarily a black and white dichotomy here. However, I do encourage people that it's like, if you're going to create these kind of agreements in your partnership, the ethical thing to do is to disclose that to whoever else you're interacting with, right? If you feel more comfortable and safe, if we have an agreement of like, okay, either of us can say no, can veto, or can pump the brakes or put in the speed bump or strap on the safety belt, whatever you want to call it, can kind of curtail the other person's behavior. It is ethical if, you're starting to date someone new, and especially if it's starting to get intimate, that like you disclose that to them. Just like, by the way, this is what's going on. There's an agreement in my relationship over here that could potentially mean I cut off all contact with you at a moment's notice, and like, that's how we get things based on consent. There are people out there who are totally okay with that, if they know that that's what I'm heading into, and there's going to be a lot of people out there who are not. And I think that's where things start to fall apart a little bit, is when people don't disclose that this is happening in their primary relationship or whatever you want to call it, that's when we start getting into a real ethical murkiness. And when I think there's a lot more potential for someone's heart or feelings to really get stomped on.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you were saying that, my like skin started to crawl a little bit. And I think it's because, so I love going back to like your poly why. And I feel like anyone who explores polyamory should absolutely start there. And one of the reasons why I'm drawn to polyamory is because I really resonate with the autonomy of the individual. Like the idea of someone saying, she's mine, it doesn't feel like, oh, I love that. That feels like icky to me. Like, I don't like that. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think because I connect so much with this idea of the autonomy of the individual, that the idea that I would enter into a polydynamic and actually feel like the opposite of autonomy, and agency, and I would feel like kind of like constriction from rules, that it feels kind of incongruous to me. Which is why I like to hear people's poly why when I start dating them, because if their poly why is like, I'm really interested in novelty, whether it's novelty of experiences or sexual whatnot, it's probably going to be a different experience that they're seeking than someone who's like, I feel like relationships are an amazing way to better understand myself and, connect with others and explore emotional intimacy and to be vulnerable and to be authentic and to be unmasked. It's probably going to be like a different experience they're seeking.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that does change for people over time, which is kind of another interesting part of it, is that sometimes depending on when you meet someone where they're at in the journey, that answer can change their poly why. Like for instance, for myself, my first stirrings towards non-monogamy, the first time that I started really considering it in the realm of reality, it started out as a sex thing. It started out that like the monogamous relationship I was in, there were things that I wanted to do sexually or kink wise that my partner was just not interested in at all. And that was fine. He was like free to say no or to say that he wasn't uncomfortable. Yeah. But at the time I was like, well, what am I supposed to do here necessarily? That was the first iteration of that. But then for me, when I actually opened up, it shifted into something really, really different. Like I realized for me, and I think this is still true to me for today, instead of it being this kind of like surface level sexuality thing, it shifted into this idea of like, I really like knowing that someone is choosing to be with me because they want to be with me, not because we agreed a year in, we're going to be monogamous and not see anybody else, and that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah.
That it's like this person could be with whoever. They could go do a random hookup. They could have a swinger party. They could have another partner. Like they're free to do whatever. And they're also choosing to be with me, and choosing to still relationship with me. And there's something about that
super sexy for sure.
Yes. And ironically to me anyway, as an individual, felt a lot safer. Yeah. Which some people, totally don't understand. And that's fine. It's not for everybody necessarily, but I think, that's some of the juice that still keeps me going even to this day,
Yeah. It's funny. You probably have heard there's this running joke among people who practice polyamory that 98% of it is communication. And then if we have any energy left over, the other 2% is sex. And I mean, obviously I started the Esther Perel Discussion Group. I live to talk about human connection and relationships. And so another part of my poly why is I'm really drawn to the communication norms. The communication norms that are in it. But I also really resonate with some of the things that you just shared about this idea of it's really sexy when someone is with you, not out of obligation or because they made a verbal commitment, 20 years ago, but because every day they're choosing that and they desire it. I'm going to go. Oh, someone just said choosing to be with me is an incredibly potent point. She didn't say point, but I like the other. And someone else said, I don't see how the intense new relationship energy can ever not overpower the more content long-term attachment energy of an established couple, just from a brain chemistry point of view. And actually, when I heard that, I thought of Esther's first book, Mating in Captivity. It's a we want the safety and security, and we want like the novelty and the and the adventure.
Yeah. And I'm glad that this person points out brain chemistry because, NRE, it is a chemical cocktail that dumps into your brain to encourage you to be sexually attracted to this person and to want to spend time around them. You have a increase in dopamine when you're around this new person and a decrease in serotonin. So that means like you're not getting that sense of satisfaction. So that's how we end up in that feeling of like, oh, I can't get enough of this person. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that like in a lot of the non-monogamous spaces and polyamorous communities, people are very aware of NRE as a thing. Mm-hmm. And so in the best case scenarios, people, first of all, are at least educated on that topic enough to know I can expect that this is going to be a thing that's going to happen in my brain. And I can enjoy it, really enjoy that natural high, really enjoy this desire to bond with this new person. And I can also be aware of it. Mm-hmm. I call it like having your head in the clouds and your feet on the ground at the same mm-hmm. time. I can also be aware this is a thing that's going on. So that means I can check in with my other partners who are more established, talk to them about what their needs are. Are they feeling neglected? Are they feeling okay? We can still communicate. And also having an awareness that like this crazy brain chemical cocktail thing that's happening, I can also have an awareness that like, it is what it is, and it is going to go away, or it's going to shift, right? Yeah. If we stay connected to someone, it shifts into more of that oxytocin chemical release, the bonding chemicals and things like that. And so that's, healthy, high functioning, non-monogamous relationships. That's how I see things play out. Like sometimes NRE comes in and sometimes people are a little bit silly or a little bit obsessed, but mostly kind of with some good communication with everybody all around, it's very manageable. Now, the thing that sometimes happens when people aren't aware of this being a brain chemistry thing is that, we see this happen all the time, especially in like serial monogamous relationships or people who are cheating or things like that. You meet someone new, you have that feeling, and then it's like, ooh, I haven't felt this way in 20 years. Clearly, this is the person I'm supposed to be with, not this jerk that I'm still with.
Right.
Sometimes that may be true. Maybe they are a jerk that you shouldn't be with, but I think that's a little bit of the different shift is that I think in our culture that really encourages serial monogamy, kind of going from one monogamous relationship to the other, it is kind of expected. Yeah, you fall in love with someone new and then you go be with them and you get rid of the old person. And so I think that's why it makes sense that this person is bringing up, how does that energy not trump the established energy? Because that's kind of the traditional model that we see. But with a lot of people who are consciously choosing non-monogamy, a lot of people are very aware, yeah, this is a thing. And if I feel this way towards this person, that's great. And I can love that. But that doesn't mean they were my actual soulmate all along. And I need to throw everybody else in the trash. I hope that makes sense for that person.
It totally makes sense. I see it. It makes a ton of sense. I see it in a different light in that, again, going back to my polyamory why, I believe that when we have that NRE-like experience, I'm laughing because I share this with the group, but I had an experience last week where I was matched with this real estate agent online. So I'd like submitted a cold inquiry, and then they're like, so-and-so will follow up with you. And then we met up last week. And I was telling the group, like, my whole sense of eroticism has been like dormant for almost the past year. And it's not because of COVID. I was in kind of like a stressful living situation and I needed to get out of it. And I ended up just buying a condo. So then I had to move into the condo and now I'm remodeling. And as I mentioned earlier, I like super thrive on routine and having like zero new decision making in my day. And it just like flipped all of that on its head. And so I felt like there was nothing left in my like erotic tank. And I just felt like that whole side of myself, which usually is, I'm usually like pretty in touch with, was just kind of like not there. And I ended up connecting with this real estate agent guy. And we just did like, it's interesting because it wasn't like a sexual exchange, but it just felt very erotic in terms of like the banter, just like the curiosity, the energy, like the playfulness. It's interesting because, why did I bring that up? I just felt like the energy from that from that exchange, like I brought to like the rest of my day, you know, like I brought to like the phone call that I had with my friend, and I brought to like my workout class later that evening. And going back to the original question, I feel like one of the reasons for why I choose polyamory is I can bring the energy that I source from new connections to my longer term relationships, almost like alchemizing it.
Yeah. I've definitely had that experience for myself as well, of even just like the flirtation, that little bit of something that reminds you, that wakes up your body and reminds you, oh, I am a sexual being after all. I have been this whole time. That's wonderful to have that woken up again in you, especially when you're surrounded or have a single established relationship or multiple established relationships, that even if it's just a flirtation, it doesn't even have to be I went and hooked up with somebody else or went on a date with somebody else, but even just that little bit of getting to see yourself almost through somebody else's eyes. And that helps you to fall in love with yourself a little bit more. And then that helps you to share that love with your established partners. Like it's a wonderful sensation. Sometimes it's a little bit harder being on the receiving end, you know, watching a partner going through that kind of little jolts of new erotic energy or excitement or things like that. But ultimately still kind of nice, you know, like I've had multiple experiences now of having long-term partners going through NRE, starting up new relationships and stuff like that. And sometimes there's little challenges along the way, or sometimes it's a little bit uncomfortable, but always a net positive at the end of the day, in my experience. And of course, that helps me personally to know that, you know, when my partner or partners are seeing new people or starting new relationships, ultimately knowing like it's going to be okay. Like they got me, they're here still. And ultimately, it's a little bit of like a rising tide raising all boats.
Yeah, this is again like another reason that I'm really drawn to polyamory, because in the moments where you have like the icky feeling when someone else is experiencing NRE, I think it's just such an amazing opportunity to look at like what are the stories that are coming up. I'm not enough. They were going to leave. He's going to like her more than me. She's going to be, you know, whatever. They're going to have better sex than we did. And to like really question those stories and maybe come up with newer, like truer, more loving stories. It's almost like a beautiful exercise in subconscious reprogramming. A lot of the stories that come up are just going to be from our childhood experiences and cultural conditioning. That's like another reason why I'm drawn to it.
Yeah, definitely. I think those things that come up for us, it's also a really interesting and important exercise, I think, to determine, you know, those moments where I feel unworthy or I feel like I'm not getting enough or I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling jealous. You know, I think it's really important to look at, is there a portion of that is just kind of my own stuff that needs to be healed, my own stuff that needs to be addressed, that needs to be cared for? Is there a portion of that does come from the relationship? Because I also don't want to totally ignore that. Like you may be carrying moments where your partner has not met your needs or currently is not meeting your needs or is not caring for you, you know? And I think that's a tricky thing when people talk about jealousy, is that pretty much always, from what I've seen, especially from working with clients for so long, is there's almost always a percentage of a certain percent that's just my own stuff I got to work through. And there's a certain percentage of like, this kind of lingering hurtful thing that happened in the relationship that needs to get resolved and needs to be readdressed with my partner, you know? And so what gets tricky is when we can't quite tell the difference between those two things, because it's pretty much never just 100%. I just need to buckle down and deal with my own shit, not talk to my partner about it. It's just me to figure it out. And it's pretty much never 100%. This is all my partner's fault to resolve, you know, and he needs to do or they need to do everything in their power to make sure that I'm comfortable. It's pretty much never on those opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's always a blend. And I think the skill is in really telling what the blend is as far as like the stuff that's coming up for you.
100%, completely agree. And I would also add, you know, Esther talks about, she has this line, behind every criticism is a veiled wish. And I think in those moments, it can be really tempting to criticize either the non-monogamy or the new partner or your partner. And I think another beautiful opportunity in those moments is to realize, like, wow, I do have a strong need in this area. And how can I communicate that to my partner and give them like a beautiful opportunity to meet that need? And in doing so, strengthen our relationship in a way where that need might not have been illuminated to me if it wasn't for this other partner. So I don't know. That's just kind of like the way my brain works. But
yeah, I think I feel the underlying theme here is that doing any kind of non-normative thing with your life or with your identity or how you move through the world is going to force you to really examine a lot of stuff within you. Like it's going to, all these like kind of painful, awkward, unexamined parts of you, doing something that's so outside the mainstream is going to pull it out into the light and force you to look at it. And that's a really uncomfortable process, but also extremely important for healing, for becoming more whole, for just becoming a better human being, a better partner, And I like that you said earlier about really liking the communication norms in a lot of non-monogamy. I don't think the communication norms are something that only belongs to non-monogamy. And that's part of on Multiamory, we have made a little bit of a shift that we started out as a podcast, initially, and it was like, well, we're polyamorous, so we're going to talk about advice that polyamorous people need, super special relationship advice that only applies to polyamorous people. And there's a little bit of that, but over time, as we kept researching and looking at all these studies and all these different communication techniques of realizing like there's just fundamental good relationship practices. And it does not matter whether you're polyamorous, monogamous, swingers, diehard married monogamous till the day you die. Like there's these fundamental things that can help all of us to be better partners to each other. And it's weird, again, to come back to this idea of the polyamory why. I feel like for me, that's baked into a little bit of my life purpose is I don't want to push any kind of relationship style on anybody. I don't want to make any arguments that non-monogamy is inherently more enlightened or spiritual or grounded or healthier, because it's definitely not by default compared to monogamy. Like, I just want people to just have better relationships, however they choose to do it. That's why I've started to get even a little bit less attached to this whole hierarchical, non-hierarchical, relationship anarchist or solo poly. At the end of the day, I'm just kind of like, are you being an ethical person, caring for your partners, getting and giving consent? Because that's like the foundation of so much of this.
100%. Yeah, I feel super connected to the ideas like behind solo poly and polyamory. But the reality is like, I haven't had any relationship, let alone multiple concurrent relationships, since I've kind of voiced that that's what I am. For me, much more important than having a lot of relationships concurrently or a lot of physical intimacy concurrently is this sense of identifying with like a value system around relationships that like reflects my beliefs.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head with the value system. We just recorded an episode that'll come out in a couple of weeks that's about figuring out personal values and relationship values, because it turns out, our values are the thing that act as our little guideposts, that act as our compass when we're in tricky situations. And you come up against tricky and confusing situations a lot when you're doing something non-normative like non-monogamy, where sometimes it's not always patently obvious what the right thing to do is or what the least harmful thing to do is. And having a strong sense of your own values will really help you with that.
Yeah. I wanted to share a quote from Esther. This was from an interview she did. Do you ever listen to Dax Shepard's show, Armchair Expert?
Oh, yes, just a couple times. Yeah.
He's had some really fun guests, like Chelsea Handler. I love Sophia Bush. Or some of the others that he's had. He gets like some big name people. But he's had Esther on twice. And I think during her first episode with him, she said, open relationships make a lot of sense, but they're not for everyone. They demand a massive amount of egalitarianism. They require two people who are sovereign, who can choose for themselves and not one person imposing it on the other. cheating happens all the time in open relationships. People will always cross boundaries. Transgression seems to be a part of relationships, period. And people always need to negotiate boundaries in both monogamous and open relationships. Everything needs to be negotiated within the couple. Consensual non-monogamy is not a protection device against transgression. It's a philosophy, a way of thinking about sexuality, freedom, and the centrality of the individual within a relationship.
Yeah, 100 A+, Esther. Well done.
Oh, there's so many times when Esther has not gotten an A+ from me.
That's okay. In this instance, she does.
Okay. One of my favorite Multiamory episodes of all time is the one on cognitive biases in relationships.
Yeah, that's kind of an older one now. That's like 170 something or other. It's been a few years.
That was like Jace's dorking out moment. Claim his, what's the phrase? Claim to fame?
His claim to fame, maybe, yeah.
So I'm curious if you can share, what are some common cognitive biases in relationships, whether it's monogamous or polyamorous, that you think like most will impact the relationship? And also, can you touch on reactance? Because that was one that I like super loved learning about.
Yeah, reactance. There's two that came to mind, and you've listened to that episode more recently than I have. So the list of cognitive biases are probably going to be fresher in your mind than mine. Yeah, reactance is definitely a strong one. Reactance is our tendency as human beings where the stronger and more forcefully we receive a message from somebody or something that we cannot do something, the more likely we are to want to rebel or just to rebel. So a common everyday example of this would be that if there's a wall where whoever owns this wall doesn't want any graffiti on it, and I think they literally did this experiment, that if you put a sign up that says, please don't make any marks on this wall, versus a sign that says, under no circumstance, like do not under any circumstance make any marks on this wall, well, guess which wall has more graffiti on it? Is the one that's much more forceful in its language. They found that this shows up in public health messaging as well. When they're trying to do public health campaigns around sexual health or vaccination for various viruses or things like that, they found the more effective messaging is to say, well, here's the facts. We'd really like you to consider doing this, but also you got to make the choice that's right for you. People respond to that a lot better than public health messaging that's saying you have to do this, you have no choice, you're a terrible person if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And so it's the same thing in relationships, especially when it comes to agreements, that again, if we kind of place strictures on a partner or sometimes even on ourselves that are like extremely intense, like some extremely intense rules, like do not under any circumstance bring someone back to our house, your partner is going to be much more likely to want to do that, to want to transgress that, to want to find loopholes. That's usually how it shows up, is instead of directly transgressing a rule, usually people try to find loopholes where it's like, well, I just brought this person into the front yard. Like, that's okay, right? And maybe the initial conversation didn't actually get at the heart of what was uncomfortable or what would be ideal for both people involved. So reactance is definitely one.
That actually came up for me. And what's so interesting is it's not like a conscious rebellion. It's much more subconscious, I think, is the level that it happens on. Yes. So I was with a couple that was very new to opening up. And the way that they were approaching it was basically, I date men. So it was the man's female partner. And basically anytime we wanted to have or experience a new act of physical intimacy, it like went through her for approval. And so what I was noticing for myself is like, I'm a big touch person when I'm attracted to someone. And so there's like a whole like buffet of different types of touch, different places I could be touched where I'd be like perfectly happy. But as soon as she's like, no, I'm not comfortable with that, then of course, like I noticed myself like feeling frustrated that we couldn't do that thing.
Yeah, that's a big mistake that I see a lot of couples make when they're first opening up. I don't think there's anything wrong with going slow and taking baby steps together that we both mutually agree on as a couple. I don't think that's wrong at all. However, definitely, I think a big pothole that I see people stumble into is okay, but don't go past this point without asking me first, or don't go back past this point until another 3 months have gone by, because, and whether that's sex or touch or saying I love you or whatever it is, the obstacle is what, the obstacle is what turns into every Victorian romance novel, right? It's all about the obstacle. It's about we want to be together, but we can't. Even if it's, we want to be together, but we can't because maybe I kind of made this misguided agreement with my partner that I thought would be okay at the time. Like it fuels and it makes the sex or the touch or whatever it is even more intense, and your partner to want it even more. Often I find it backfires. It's not the effect that people are hoping. People are hoping that it's like this is going to be a cooling the jets kind of process if I put in an obstacle or ask you to, wait an arbitrary amount of time. And the reality is that it fires up those jets. It throws fuel on the fire. It becomes much more frustrating and much more likely that someone's going to straight up just want to break the rule or transgress or like violate a boundary or really betray trust in some way. Another one that comes to mind as far as cognitive biases is also what's known as the halo effect. And this is this idea that people who, if we see one good trait in a person or a trait that we like, we're much more likely to project that onto the rest of them and their traits. So super common example of this is we see someone who's attractive and we are much more likely to think they must be just a better person in general, a more moral person, a more ethical person, a person who's going to be better at their job. Unfortunately, of course, we've seen all the studies where this shows up of like attractive people being more likely to be hired for a job or more likely to get special perks or special bonuses because of the halo effect. The way that this shows up in relationships is with stuff like NRE. When we're falling in love with somebody, is because our powers of discernment kind of go, a little bit haywire, not entirely gone, but sometimes a little bit haywire, that sometimes, because we're connecting to this new awesome person who's so sexy and so attractive, that sometimes we're less likely to see some red flags along the way. And that is something that I found has been really helpful, to actually have multiple partners in your circle or multiple friends that you trust, because these are people who can talk to you about these things and be like, okay, interesting. So you're dating this person who says that they could never be happy with non-monogamy. That's interesting. How do you feel about that? That seems like a little bit of a red flag. That can actually be helpful to have people not an NRE in your sphere to be there to talk about what's going on.
Yeah. And our group serves as a great
yes,
place
definitely.
for that. Yeah. I'm laughing because the first time I had dated someone who was emotionally unavailable, total halo effect, in that he was extremely smart and like witty and funny. And then when I started to see the emotional unavailability, I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I'm like, he's so smart. How could he not be smart about his feelings?
We've all been there. We've all been there. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. So I wanted to quickly touch on some group member questions, and then we'll close with some song therapy. And I love the song that you picked.
Great.
Okay. So have you experienced, and the question isn't about you, more just like looking for advice. Have you experienced moving from a hierarchical non-monogamous relationship to non-hierarchical? What are your experiences or suggestions if one partner experiences some anxieties about losing the other?
Yeah, that's a big old question. I can probably only really speak to my personal experience, as well as, stuff I've drawn from working with clients. And I'm going to try to answer that as succinctly as possible. So firstly, yes, do have personal experience moving from a more hierarchical format into non-hierarchical. Now, for me, something that was really formative in that was, for me, starting out really attached to the hierarchy that I had in my relationship. So this was several years ago. It was my first experience dating someone who had multiple partners, but most importantly, it was my first experience where like they were seeing someone who also, it was very emotionally intimate and a very important relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my experience up to this point had been, I'm the primary partner, everyone else is kind of like a casual friend or a casual sex buddy or whatever it is. And this was my first time where there was another partner involved who was actually quite emotionally intimate. And he started dating both of us around the same time. So it was even like this interesting experience of kind of two of these relationships almost in parallel, getting more and more intimate and more intense. And I, at the time, it was so brand new to me, and like I hated it. Like I could not let go of this. Like, well, my only security is to be number one. That's the only safe position, is to be the primary partner. And so I really need to get into that safe position. And so I did everything in my power, absolutely everything in my power, including just total bend over backwards and having zero boundaries to try to get that top spot, right? Like I wanted to be the primary partner. I don't want this other person to be the primary partner. I don't want to lose. And I did. I got to the magical day where we had the magical conversation where my partner dropped the magical word primary partner in relation to me. And I felt great for about a day. It was fantastic. Felt super safe, super secure, loved it. Then the problem was, oh, I'm on top of the rock, and now I need to make sure no one else climbs on top of the rock. Like, this isn't actually as secure that I thought it would, because if my partner can just like point at me and choose, you're the primary partner, he also has the power to take that away, or at least I'd given him the power to take that away and choose somebody else. And so for me, it was
exhausting just listening to it.
Yeah, it was a really terrible wake-up call for me to realize, ooh, this thing that I thought was going to be so safe wasn't actually safe, because then it became about really clinging on to that and still feeling really threatened if anybody else was starting to get close to that. And now I share that not like, I don't think anyone who's a primary partner may not have that experience. It may feel differently for you. Like, that's totally fine. This was just my experience. And so that was my gateway into realizing I think I need to find ways to feel safe and secure in my relationships that's not just based on a title. That instead of seeking the title, I should be seeking what I actually needed, which took me a while to figure out. And so that really formed the basis of my relationship philosophy now, which is that anytime I find myself clinging to wanting a particular title, the title of primary partner, or being at the top of the hierarchy or stuff like that, I really have to sit down and examine, okay, what are the things that I actually need and want here in order to have a healthy relationship? And what are the things where it's like actually underneath seeking the title are the things that I should be looking for? Is that reassurance from my partner? Is that like a regular date night? Is it I've been feeling a little bit lonely and neglected? I think it's just, for me, it shifting into non-hierarchy opened up a much broader palette of how I could find security and safety in a relationship. There was another part to that question that I've completely forgotten. What was the second half of that?
I love that so much. It reminds me a little bit of like designer relationships. Because when I think about myself and my needs, I would say I have like a really like ocean deep need for emotional connection if I'm romantically involved with someone, but I don't want to spend all my time with them. Like, I very consciously don't want to share a home. I don't want to, raise kids, merge finances. I like a lot of solo time. And I love like vulnerability. I love developing intimacy. I love like sharing my inner world. So I need like a whole lot of that with a partner, but like not a whole lot of time.
Right.
And so I just think there's so much value, rather than like grasping onto a title like primary partner to create safety. It's like thinking about like, what needs do I get met from this connection that like most fill my buckets? And then how can I, meet as many of those as possible? It's just like, it makes so much more sense and is so much less exhausting.
Yes. Yeah. 100%.
The second part of the question was, what are your suggestions if one partner experiences anxieties about losing the other?
Yeah. So that's the part of the question that's like very context dependent, very, very context dependent, because that's going to depend, I think the first piece of advice I would give is to get curious about the anxiety for the same reason, get curious about, does this feel old and familiar? Does this link back to older relationship stuff or older childhood stuff? And maybe write or journal or kind of take a little bit of an inventory of what comes up for you. And it's also really important to look at the anxiety and think about, what are the things that I'm scared of in the future? What are the tangible things I'm scared of losing? Is it time? Is it status? Is it going on, is it meeting family? I think it's really important first to do kind of the data collection portion of the process of like, what's actually going on here? And some of that, again, you can figure out, maybe some of it is just kind of my own stuff to work on, but maybe some of it is stuff I can collaborate with on my partner to make sure that like I still feel safe and still feel held and still feel heard when things are scary or when I have a fear of losing everything coming up, like ideally your partner is also open and loving and willing to compassionately listen and collaborate with you as well to figure out, okay, what are the things that we can do to help this feel a little bit easier that works for both of us? That's some very generalized, broad pass advice, just in a nutshell. I realize different people's situations is going to be different, but I think there are some good places to start.
Yeah. What you share reminded me, I was listening to an interview that Esther did with Scott Galloway, who's a NYU professor. And she was talking about how one of the best things a couple can do is to recognize their differences and see them as complementary. And one of the things I've noticed is so often when a new partner enters the mix and they're very different from, let's say it's a new woman entering the mix and she's very different from the female primary partner, that it can be seen as competition. Wow, like she does X so much better than me, or she does Y and that's not an area that I'm good at. She's athletic and I'm artsy, and rather than seeing that as like competition, a threat, an area that I'm deficient in, seeing it as like, it's so great that she's able to, to bring, I don't know, that new element into our sphere, or like she's able to go hiking with my partner. I hate hiking. He's been wanting to hike for like a decade, and like to be able to appreciate the complementarity versus seeing it as competition.
Yeah. In my own personal journey, I definitely went through a lot of different versions of that. I think I started out where if my partner was dating someone who was very different from me, I interpreted that as like, ooh, that's what he actually wants. I should change myself to be a little bit closer to that in some way. And so, that would manifest in some weird stuff, picking up some weird hobbies, dressing in weird ways, doing different weird stylistic things that weren't really me, but I just kind of assumed, oh, if he's pursuing this person, that must mean that that's what he actually wants. And yeah, I think that what this reminds me of when you're talking about comparison to another person, it actually makes me think about the ways that we talk about jealousy and comparison, not in relationships, but in the professional world. Because we talk about those things very, very differently in the professional world than we do in relationships. In the professional world, if we have a coworker, a colleague who we feel jealous of or we compare ourselves to, that opens up a lot more interesting and arguably healthier questions, because you can ask yourself the question of like, okay, am I jealous of them? Am I comparing myself to them because they are doing something that I've wished to do for a long time? Yeah. Like they're pursuing a dream that I've wished to pursue, or they're a hobby or whatever. And maybe that's a message to you of like, okay, clearly it's important to me to act on some impulses that I haven't, to kind of pursue some things that I haven't. Or is it just that? Is it just like this person is different from me, and I'm just jealous because they're getting something that I'm not, like, again, it's kind of the same thing that like, there's so many different ways that we can take comparison and, use it almost as a superpower to our advantage to highlight the things that we do want for ourselves in our lives. Or it can be, used for evil to just kind of make ourselves feel more miserable about ourselves.
Yeah, 100%. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, just like questioning the stories and using the triggers as a way, if we need to express needs that we haven't yet, or need to work on areas that we haven't yet, to use it as a way to better yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, amazing. So let's go on to our closing song therapy segment.
Yeah.
So for anyone who's unfamiliar, so Song Therapy is an exclusive video series within the Esther Perel Discussion Group where we unpack the relationship dysfunction in popular songs. And I always give our guests the opportunity to pick the song. And I had actually, maybe I'm like living under a rock. I do listen to a lot of like rap and R&B. But this is a song called Genghis Khan by Mike Snow. And I linked up the music video. I imagine the music video was one of the reasons why you picked the song too.
Yeah.
Can you, and like, bravo on this really unexpected but brilliant choice.
Thank you.
Can you describe the music video and why you picked the song?
Yeah. So this is one of the things where, as you'll see from the lyrics of the song, the first time I heard the song, I thought it was catchy, but I was like, ooh, these lyrics are kind of toxic. Don't love that so much. Music video, I freaking love, hands
Amazing.
Down. Yeah. I really highly recommend people go watch the music video. Basically, in a nutshell, we watch this scene, this kind of like a James Bond ripoff scene where we have like a Bond villain, he's bald, he's got like some kind of weird like gold prosthetic on his face, like very classic Bond villain. He's got James Bond or a James Bond lookalike essentially strapped down to a table that he's about to laser, like very classic scene.
Yeah. And
essentially the arc of the story that gets told is that actually James Bond and this Bond villain were in love once. Like they had a breakup, and the Bond villain is like really torn up about, do I kill him or do I let him go? It's kind of a like, do I stay or do I go, in the relationship. And by the end of the music video, they reconcile and they have this really wonderful like suburban life, this Bond villain and James Bond, like making coffee in the morning and having 2 kids and just having a wonderful time. And there's also like great choreography at the same time. So it's really, really good, and I think really, really interesting, and also really, really novel to see that relationship turn out to be actually a queer relationship. So I love it for that, and I highly recommend that people go and watch it. Yeah.
One of the things that stood out for me is there's this guy who clearly has a pretty freaky side. I mean, you described it in a way that that I hadn't quite seen. To me, it seemed very like kink, BDSM, sexual when I first saw it.
You see that?
And so the way, like the filter through which I saw it was this guy has like a super freaky side that he's not able to explore. And he goes back home to like the beautiful, Leave It to Beaver, June Cleaver wife and the 2 kids. And they're sitting at the table past the salad type moment, and he looks like he's going to kill himself. And then he goes back to the gay man who wants to do like the freaky sexual stuff, and he like comes alive. And that was kind of what stood out to me, is like choosing between what society says we should want and what we actually want. And I feel like obviously there are parallels to non-monogamy as well.
Yeah. No, I like that interpretation. That makes a lot of sense.
Were there any lyrics that stood out to you in terms of like relationship dysfunction, enmeshment, attachment?
Yes. So the actual lyrics, I don't think necessarily fit the music video or that message of the music video. Like it's not exactly a direct tie, but that's pretty common with music videos. And I also found some interesting trivia about the songwriter and this song as well. So I'll save that for the end. But first, in the first verse, which I'll try to go through super quickly, he says, I know there's no form and no labels to put on to this thing we keep and dip into when we need. And I don't have the right to ask where you go at night, but the waves hit my head to think someone's in your bed. And then we go straight into the chorus, which is, I get a little bit Genghis Khan, don't want you to get it on with nobody else but me. And to really drive it home in the next verse, it kind of gets a little bit more clear and clear each time. He ends up just saying straight out, I don't really want you, girl, but you can't be free because I'm selfish, I'm obscene. So it is laying out this pretty toxic relationship dynamic that unfortunately I've seen play out many times. This sense of like, well, I like having my freedom to date who I want, to sleep with who I want. But the idea of this other person that I'm connected to doing that too really rubs me the wrong way. I want to be free, but I don't want them to be free. I want to be able to sleep with whoever I want, but I don't want her to be able to sleep with whoever she wants.
So, and I interpreted that lyric differently too. The way I saw it was the guy who's deviant wants the facade of like, this is what culture says you should have, which is the wife and the 2 kids and pass the salad at dinner time. I interpreted as him thinking about that regarding his wife, in that the lyric was, to the evenness I fake, it's a cheat somewhere, because I don't really want you, girl. Like, he doesn't want her, but he doesn't want her to be free because he wants the facade of like, the white picket fence and the heterosexual couple.
That's how a lot of people live also. That's also a really common thing that I see, is that sometimes caught between wanting to be sexually expressive, wanting to explore your sexuality or kink or just sleeping with other people or whatever, but then caught in that push-pull because it's like, ooh, but what if that meant sacrificing this stable life or this life that I've come to be associated with, which maybe I don't even actually really want, but the idea of losing that life or the idea of my partner also getting that freedom is just like too upsetting to me. There's, it reminds me of, there's an Oscar Wilde quote, actually, I think from The Portrait of Dorian Gray, where he says something to the effect of, there are so many things that we would feel comfortable to put down if we weren't afraid of other people picking them up after us. And he said that in relation to relationships. And I think a lot of us have had that experience of being with someone and we know maybe the relationship's over. Maybe we're not interested in that person so much anymore, but the idea of that person moving on from us and dating someone else feels too scary. And so we cling on.
There's an Oscar Wilde quote, I think it's in the beginning of Esther's book, Mating in Captivity. And I thought that's where you were going to go with this. Mm-hmm. And I love that you didn't, because now I get to read another one. So it's an Oscar Wilde quote, and he goes, there are 2 tragedies in life. One is not to get your heart's desire, and the other is to get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Kind of a similar, like when you think about like scripts about mononormativity, and it's, you find the one and you get married and it's like, you think that's what you want. And then, it can be limiting. It can be constraining, I think, for some people.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's been a lot of, I think, classic kind of observations for a long time. I think especially before non-monogamy really hit the mainstream of, like the classic ball and chain observation. I think the stuff that Esther Perel was writing in response to is this kind of like, oh my God, how do we deal with this contradiction of wanting someone to be our soulmate and be with us for the rest of our lives, but then finding that actually maybe sometimes boring or a lack of variety or not great exactly all the time.
Or like they're great at management Inc. Like they're great at like helping me run domestic life and great activity buddies, but we're totally different sexually. Right. And we both have sex drives for completely different things, right?
Exactly. So I looked into the lyrics of this song and I learned that, so Andrew Wyatt is the name of the lead singer of Mike Snow. And he said about this song that I mean, he himself was literally in this long distance relationship with a woman, and it was kind of undefined. And he didn't want to commit to her, and yet he found himself not wanting her to sleep with anybody else. It was like literally like the song says. And he has this really interesting quote from an interview where he says that, I felt that the nature of tyranny comes from that place where you're entitled to freedom and choice, and the other person has to be subjected to your scheme of things. And he clarified, he's like, in this song, I'm not endorsing Genghis Khan. Like, I'm calling myself out on some shitty behavior and shitty thinking patterns. So I actually feel like, okay, I want to give you some points for at least recognizing that about yourself, of like, this is really unfair and actually borderline tyrannical, you know, this thing that I'm feeling about this particular person.
I feel like that quote could apply to the one penis policy too.
Yeah, that too. It's like that exactly.
I have to call out that I had said earlier, I had referenced Jace's dorking out moment with the kind of the biases episode. And someone commented, Jace only had one dorking out moment, because I refer to it as Jace's dorking out moment. So I Jace a little love from our
now all three of us are pretty big dorks with very different subjects. We all have our various dorking out moments.
Totally. And I am obsessed with Emily's voice. Tell her she
best
has
voice.
Best voice.
Best voice in the universe. Best voice for radio. Like, just best voice. Absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dedeker, for joining us today. Tell people what you're up to, how they can connect with you.
Yeah, so let me think about where to start first. So I work as a relationship coach, have for the last 5 years. I work with individuals and couples and groups of 3 or more, depending, in working out relationship issues, communication issues. So if people are interested in that, they can go to my website, which is just dedekerwinston.com. You know, just make sure that you spell my name right, double check the spelling. They can get more information about my coaching services. I also have a book that came out in 2017 called The Smart Girl's Guide to Polyamory. It's a pretty good primer on polyamory if you're in the phase of just kind of looking to get yourself educated, looking to get started, kind of figure out what this is all about. I also co-host the Multiamory podcast. So you can go to multiamory.com, or you can just look up Multiamory in your favorite podcast player. The super exciting thing is that this hasn't been officially announced yet, but we're writing a book at Multiamory. We're in the process of negotiating a publishing contract. Yeah, so we're going to be putting out a book on communication tools that are inclusive of non-traditional relationships. So again, we don't have any kind of official page or source on that, but if people follow us, then you'll probably get more information about that as the book development process goes along.
Amazing. And I know you're a group member, so feel free to share about it. You're welcome to as soon as it comes out.
I appreciate that.
Amazing. Okay, lots of like fun, more like Greek chorus style comments than question comments. So lots of love for you.
Great.
Anyway, thank you, Dedeker, so much for joining us from Seattle. You're getting some claps.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, just appreciate everything you do, and, you know, contribute to people having better relationships.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for having me in the group. And I'm really looking forward to interacting with all y'all a little bit more.
Amazing. Okay, have a great rest of your day. I know you're on Pacific time, so you've still got some good sunlight and some time to get outside. Yes. And we'll catch you guys in the group soon. Next week, we're going to be with Dr. David Leah. We're going to be talking about cuckolding. We're going to be talking about some other current events. I think the title of the Facebook Live is The Intersection Between Masculinity, Racism, Violence, and Shame. So a really light Facebook Live next week, but an important one. Let's see. Someone just said, you're the first guest in a while not in Costa Rica. That is hilarious and true.
I mean, I wish I was in Costa Rica.
Do you know Megan Bhatia, the host of the Amory podcast?
I've heard of the Amory podcast. I don't know Megan personally, though. I don't think we've connected.
So Megan's in Costa Rica, and then Jessica Fern is in Costa Rica.
Right. Yeah. I have a lot of clients in Costa Rica. Apparently, it's a good place to be these days.
Amazing. Okay. Thanks to everyone. We'll catch you guys in the group soon, and have an amazing rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Bye, guys.